The wind howled through the Colorado wilderness like a wounded animal. Snow lashed sideways, blinding and bitter, devouring sound and light alike. Most men would have been huddled inside on a night like this. Most men would have bolted their doors and left the mountains to the wolves. But Gideon Hartley wasn't most men. At 6'5", he moved like a shadow cut from rock, broad-shouldered and silent beneath a thick duster and brown cowboy hat dusted with snow. The storm bit into his skin like teeth, but he barely flinched. Gideon had weathered 20 winters alone in these mountains. He'd thought he'd seen everything the world had to offer. But nothing. Not war, not betrayal, not even the death of his wife had prepared him for what he found under that snow-covered pine. 2 tiny shapes, curled together like kittens. He almost missed them. The tracks were faint, almost erased by the wind, but something had told him to follow, something deeper than instinct, louder than logic. And now he knelt in the snow, heart pounding. The girls couldn't have been more than 6 years old, their dresses light blue cotton, torn and thin where soaked through. One of them had her arm wrapped protectively around the other. Their lips were blue, their hands like ice. Gideon didn't hesitate. He shed his coat and wrapped them both inside it, cradling them close against his chest. One stirred weakly, her breath a whimper. "You're all right now," he whispered, voice rough with disuse. "You're with me." It was 3 miles back to his cabin, uphill most of the way. Carrying 2 frozen children through a blizzard would have broken lesser men. But Gideon Hartley was carved from something harder than stone. He didn't stop, didn't breathe easy until he'd kicked open his door, slammed it shut against the shrieking wind, and laid the girls down beside the fireplace. He stoked the fire until it blazed, peeled off their wet clothes, and wrapped them in every blanket and fur he owned. His hands, usually steady, shook as he checked their fingers and toes. Frostbite. Early, but not past saving. One of the girls whimpered. "Hush now," he murmured. "You're safe." "I'm here." They didn't speak, just shivered and clung to each other like they were all the other had left in the world. Gideon moved about the cabin with practiced care. He boiled water, mixed broth, tore soft bread into tiny pieces. When one girl opened her eyes bright, sky-colored and far too old for her years, he knelt down beside her. "What's your name, sweetheart?" She didn't answer, just reached out, barely touching his beard with her fingers, as if to make sure he was real. He sighed. "All right. We'll figure it out in the morning." He poured broth into a tin mug and helped each girl sip, one hand steadying their heads. The stronger one, the one who opened her eyes first, swallowed without complaint. The other, frailer, quieter, took longer. As he tucked them back into the pile of furs, he whispered, "I'll call you Faith. And you Hope, because that's what you gave me tonight. Something I thought I'd buried long ago." They slept at last, curled tight beside the fire. Gideon sat in his old leather chair, watching them as the storm battered his cabin. He hadn't had company in years, not since Catherine left, not since the world turned meaner than he could bear. Above the hearth hung an old rifle. Beside it, a Bible with cracked leather and pages worn thin from long-ago use. He hadn't opened it in 15 years. Not since Catherine walked out the door. But now he found his hand reaching for it, thumb brushing the faded initials on the cover. The fire cracked, the wind howled, and 2 little girls slept like they'd been delivered to the only safe place left in the world. Hours passed. Dawn was still hours away. The blizzard had not let up, but inside the warmth grew. Gideon dozed, head against the back of the chair, until a voice woke him. "Mister." He opened his eyes. Hope, the quieter one, stood beside his knee, still wrapped in the thick wool of his old Union blanket. Her cheeks were pink again, her lips no longer blue. "You're safe," he said again, as if repeating it made it true. "Mama said to run," she whispered. "Said to find the good man by the sleeping bear mountain." His breath caught. He knew that name. Locals had always called the peak behind his homestead Bear Mountain, shaped like a grizzly curled to rest. What else did she say? Hope glanced at her sister, who was now sitting up in bed. Faith nodded. Hope reached into the torn seam of her dress and pulled out something silver. A locket. Old, scratched, but clean. She handed it to him. Gideon opened the locket with calloused fingers. Inside was a tiny portrait daguerreotype, maybe 20 years old. A young woman with soft eyes. Familiar eyes. Eyes he hadn't seen in 15 years. His chest tightened. Catherine. His daughter. Faith was crying now, soft and soundless. "The bad man hurt her," Hope said. "We hid in the closet. She told us to run." Gideon stared into the fire, gripping the locket so tight the metal bit into his palm. The world spun sideways. His daughter, dead. These girls, Catherine's girls. He leaned forward slowly, voice thick. "What's your mama's name?" Hope looked up at him. "Catherine. Catherine Ashworth." The name struck him like a hammer. Ashworth. That smug son of a railroad baron Catherine had run off with all those years ago. The one Gideon had forbidden. The one he'd called a mistake. He'd cut her off, thinking he was protecting her from heartbreak. Now she was dead, and her babies had found their way to him through a blizzard. Gideon stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. His boots thudded heavy on the plank floor. He wasn't a man given to tears. But something behind his ribs cracked wide open. She'd remembered. Even after all those years, even after he'd slammed the door in her face, Catherine had remembered, had trusted him. Hope watched him carefully. "Are you the good man, mister?" He turned toward her, voice breaking. "I don't know, little one. But I'm gonna try real damn hard to be." Outside, the storm eased. The wind slowed. Snow drifted lazily now, soft and silent. Inside the cabin, Gideon Hartley sat back in his chair, the locket still in his hand, and watched the sleeping faces of the girls he now knew were his blood. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, on this bitter Christmas Eve, one thing was clear. He wasn't alone anymore. And he'd kill any man who tried to take them from him. What Gideon didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that by morning, riders would be on their trail, and that the man who'd broken his daughter's spirit hadn't come looking to claim the children out of love. He'd come to silence them, for good. Morning broke pale and silent, the storm's fury spent, leaving the mountains blanketed in heavy, pristine snow. The sun filtered weakly through the pines, throwing soft golden light across the clearing outside Gideon's cabin. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. The girls still slept, curled beneath the layers of fur and wool, the occasional twitch of a limb or fluttering eyelid, the only signs they were still alive. Gideon hadn't slept at all. He sat in the same leather chair, elbows on knees, the locket resting in his calloused hands. He turned it over again and again, as if it might offer answers if he just looked hard enough. Catherine. It had been 15 years since she'd called him Papa. 15 years since she'd stood on the porch of this same cabin, suitcase in hand, eyes brimming with tears and fury as she'd told him she was leaving. She was marrying Randall Ashworth. She didn't need his blessing, only his silence. And Gideon, stubborn, unforgiving, proud beyond reason, had given her just that. Now she was gone, murdered, and her daughters, his granddaughters, were asleep in the corner of a cabin that had once been hers too. If he closed his eyes, he could still see little Catherine running across the floor, wild dark hair and dirt-smudged cheeks, begging him to tell her stories from the war, to let her hold the Bible even though it was heavy with God. Gideon's eyes burned. He hadn't cried in decades, but his throat ached from holding something back. The younger girl stirred. Faith, the more guarded one. She blinked up at him from the bed, then sat up slowly. Her eyes, blue-gray like a winter sky before snowfall, studied him with a caution that was older than it had any right to be. He nodded toward her sister. "She all right?" Faith nodded once. "Hope always sleeps harder." "You hungry?" Another nod. She didn't speak. "Not yet." He stood, poured water into the kettle, and swung it over the fire. A few minutes later, the cabin smelled faintly of oats and dried apples. He ladled porridge into a tin bowl and handed it to her, watching as she took it politely, murmuring a quiet thank you. Her hands were small but steady now, fingers pink again instead of ghostly white. "She always this quiet?" he asked. Faith shrugged. "Hope talks more." "Noticed that?" She hesitated, then looked up at him with the kind of gaze that didn't belong on a 6-year-old's face. "You were in the war?" Gideon blinked. "How'd you guess?" "You look like the men in Mama's pictures." Hard, but tired. He let out a breath through his nose. "That's about right?" She turned her attention back to the porridge, but he could feel her thoughts ticking behind her eyes. Hope woke not long after, stretching like a cat, rubbing sleep from her face with the back of her hand. When she spotted the bowl of porridge, she grinned. "Smells like Mama's," she said, sliding off the bed and padding over to sit beside her sister. Gideon offered her a second bowl, and this time she didn't hesitate. The two girls ate side by side, passing the tin mug of water between them like it was the most normal thing in the world. But something about them, the way they moved in sync, the way Faith guarded every word while Hope smiled just enough to distract, told Gideon they'd been through something far from normal. Their dresses confirmed it. Pale blue cotton, delicate stitching along the hem, lace frayed at the cuffs. Expensive ones. Their braids were still mostly intact, even after the storm, and there were remnants of silk ribbon in Hope's hair. Not the kind of children who grew up in the mountains or ran wild through mining camps. Someone had loved them, dressed them with care. He set down the bowl and sat across from them. "Where'd you two come from?" Faith looked away. Hope hesitated. Then slowly she reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out the locket again. She crossed the floor and pressed it into Gideon's hand. "You know her," she said. He nodded, throat tight. "Catherine." Hope sat beside him. "She said if something bad ever happened, we had to find the man by the Sleeping Bear Mountain. Said he'd keep us safe." Faith looked up now, eyes wary. "Are you him?" "I reckon I am." Neither girl smiled, but neither looked away. "What happened?" he asked softly. Faith's mouth moved, but no sound came. It was Hope who answered. "There was yelling. Mama told us to go to the closet. She gave us the locket and told us not to come out, no matter what." Hope's voice cracked. Then there was a loud noise, like a slap, but worse. And we waited, and waited. And when we came out, she trailed off. Gideon didn't push. Faith picked up the story, her voice low and almost monotone, like she was reading from memory. There was blood. On the floor. On her nightdress. We shook her, but she wouldn't wake up. Mama said to run if anything ever happened. So we did. We took the paper she drew. It showed the river. And the mountain Hope added, "She said to follow it to the fork, then head toward the mountain that looks like a bear sleeping." Gideon rubbed his hand over his jaw, swallowing down something thick and bitter. "Who hurt her?" They both went quiet. Then Faith whispered, "The bad man." Hope nodded. "He smells like dead flowers." The description hit Gideon like a bullet to the gut. Randall Ashworth. Catherine had married him after Gideon refused his blessing. A silver-tongued banker turned railroad investor. Always smelled too sweet. Always looked too clean. A man who treated people like property. "He hurt her?" Gideon asked. Faith nodded. Did he see you? No, Hope whispered. We were hiding. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. You did good, girls. Real good. Hope reached back into her dress and pulled something else from a hidden pocket, a scrap of silk, stained dark. She offered it to him. From Mama's night dress, she said, so we don't forget. He took it in his palm. Blood, dried and rust-colored. The silk was torn clean through. These girls weren't making up fairy tales. They'd seen things no child should have to witness. He stood and crossed the cabin to the shelf beside the hearth. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a worn leather ledger and a pencil stub. He opened it, turned to the first blank page, and began to write. Names, dates, what the girls had said, details about the locket, the dress, the direction they'd come from. Because if this was going to court someday, and it might, he needed to remember every word. When he finished, he turned back to the girls. You both got names? They hesitated. Hope answered first. She calls me Addie sometimes. But Mama said my name is Adelaide Faith, whispered Victoria. Adelaide and Victoria, Catherine's daughters. Gideon nodded. All right. But if it's all right with you, I'd like to keep calling you Hope and Faith for now. It suits you, they both nodded solemnly. That afternoon, while the storm gave way to quiet snow, Gideon taught the girls how to split kindling. He made a stew with the last of his salted venison. Faith watched every move he made like a hawk. Hope followed him like a shadow. By nightfall, they were tucked into the same corner bed, cheeks warm, limbs finally relaxed. As he pulled the blanket over them, Hope reached for his hand. Mister? Yeah? Are you going to send us back? His chest ached. Back where? To the bad man. No, sweetheart. Not a chance in hell, Faith opened her eyes. Even if he comes... He sat on the edge of the bed. If he comes, he's going to have to go through me. Neither girl said anything, but they both snuggled deeper under the blanket. He stayed by their side until their breathing evened out. The fire crackled. The wind outside had calmed. But somewhere far off, a distant echo rode in on the wind. Hooves. 3 horses moving slowly but steadily along the frozen creek bed. And they were getting closer. The snow had stopped sometime in the night. Morning sunlight filtered through the frost-bitten windows of the cabin, laying golden stripes across the floorboards. The fire had burned low again, but the cabin held its warmth, more from the 3 lives inside it than the embers themselves. Gideon stood at the stove, stirring a pot of coffee with a steady hand, but his mind was far from steady. Catherine. He couldn't stop seeing her face. Not the daguerreotype version frozen inside the locket, but the last real memory, the day she'd stormed out of this very cabin, eyes flashing with fire and heartbreak. Her voice had cracked when she shouted that she never wanted to see him again. And like a fool, he'd let her go. He'd spent years convincing himself she'd forgotten him. But she hadn't. She'd told her daughters, his granddaughters, about the Sleeping Bear Mountain, had drawn them a map. She'd sent them to him when she had nowhere else to turn. She'd remembered. Faith sat quietly at the table, her small fingers wrapped around a tin cup of warm milk. Hope knelt near the fireplace, brushing ash off a stone she'd found outside. Their silence was no longer from shock. It was habit, survival. He cleared his throat. Girls. Both heads turned. You said last night, the bad man hurt your mama. Did you see his face? They exchanged a look. Faith looked down. Hope stepped forward, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire. We didn't see all of it. It was dark, but we saw his coat. Black, long, real clean. Mama always said that coat was like a snake's skin. Looked nice, but it hid something nasty. Faith added quietly. He had blood on his hands. Hope nodded. and he smelled like old flowers, like the ones you leave on a grave. The description made Gideon's gut twist. Randall Ashworth. He hadn't seen the man in nearly 2 decades, but that sickly sweet cologne, that smug black overcoat, he remembered them well. Ashworth had shown up once at the homestead, all smooth words and clean fingernails, offering promises and threats disguised as opportunities. Gideon had told him to leave. Catherine had followed him. And now she was dead. "You said your mama drew you a map," he asked. Faith stood, walked to her bundle of belongings in the corner, and pulled out a crumpled paper, folded over so many times the edges had worn thin. She brought it to Gideon and placed it gently in his hand. He unfolded it slowly. The drawing was crude but clear. A crooked stream, 2 peaks, a circle labeled Bear. At the base, a small X with 3 words written in a child's hand, Good Man Cabin. He stared at the paper so long the fire cracked loudly, making Hope flinch. How did she know I was still here?" he murmured. Faith spoke without looking up. "Mama said the good man never leaves, that he built the house with his own hands and he'd stay till the mountains fell." The words hit him harder than he expected. That was something Catherine used to say when she was little. "Papa ain't movin' nowhere, less the mountain does first." She used to say it with her whole heart, back when she believed in him. Gideon looked back down at the drawing, then up at the girls. Why didn't she come herself? Neither answered. "She wanted to," Hope whispered, "but he wouldn't let her." Faith looked up. Her voice trembled now. "She tried once. He locked her in the bedroom. Said if she ever ran again, we'd disappear." Gideon clenched his jaw, trying to keep his hands from trembling. "She waited until Christmas Eve," Faith continued. "He drank too much." She knew he'd pass out, but he didn't. He caught her packing. "She made us promise," Hope said. "She said if anything happened, we had to run. Find the good man. Give him the locket. And never, ever tell anyone our real names unless we felt safe." Safe. They were looking at him like he could protect them, like he deserved that kind of trust. He didn't. Not yet. Not after what he'd done to their mother. He rose abruptly and stepped outside, boots crunching the snow. The cold slapped him hard, but he welcomed it. The cabin door creaked behind him. Small feet followed. Hope tugged his coat. "You mad at Mama?" He knelt so they were eye level. "I was. A long time ago. But now? No, sweetheart. I'm just mad at myself." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because when she needed me most, I wasn't there. And that's something a father's never supposed to say." Faith stood in the doorway, arms crossed, gaze sharp. "She still loved you," she said. "Even when she cried, she said you were the strongest man she knew." Gideon swallowed hard. They went back inside. He wrapped the girls in fresh blankets, sat beside the hearth, and pulled out his Bible, the one he hadn't opened in 15 years. As he thumbed through the pages, a slip of folded paper fell out. He picked it up and stared. It was a letter, unopened, postmarked 12 years ago, from Denver, from Catherine. His hands shook as he opened it. "Papa, I don't know if you'll read this, but I need you to know I'm trying to leave. I was wrong. You were right about him. He's cruel. I stayed because I thought it was best for the girls. But now I think the only safe place left is where I grew up. If I can get away, I'm coming home. If I don't make it, please, please find my babies. Love, Cat." The words blurred as his eyes burned. She had tried, and he never even knew. He looked up. Faith and Hope were watching him, quiet and still. "You girls want to stay a while?" he asked softly. Faith nodded. Hope ran into his arms. He held them both, heart pounding like war drums. Outside, a raven circled the mountain top. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the snow. Gideon stood at the door, the girls behind him, and stared out into the wilderness. 3 silhouettes moved slowly across the far ridge, riders coming closer, and not for a friendly visit. The sound of hooves cracked across the morning stillness like a shot. Gideon froze at the cabin's threshold, hand instinctively drifting toward the Winchester hanging by the doorframe. On the far ridge, silhouetted by the low winter sun, 3 riders descended in a slow, deliberate line. Not ranchers, not trappers. They rode too clean, too straight. One of them wore a badge that caught the sunlight in a glint of silver. Hope and Faith stood just behind Gideon, their small hands clutched tight to his coat. He turned, crouched to meet their eyes. Back room, under the rug, there's a trap door. Crawl in and stay quiet. No matter what you hear, you don't make a sound. Understand? Faith nodded immediately. Hope hesitated. Will you be okay? She asked, eyes wide. I've made it through worse, Gideon said. Now go. He watched until the trap door thudded softly shut. Then he took down the rifle, loaded it, and placed it by the chair knot in hand, but close enough. The riders dismounted a few minutes later. Snow crunched under boots as they approached. The man in the lead knocked twice, sharp and deliberate. Gideon opened the door but didn't step aside. Morning, the lead rider said. He was in his late 40s, clean-shaven, angular face, worn duster, and a polished star pinned to his chest. Marshal Thomas Wright, he said. U.S. Territory badge. These 2 behind me are hired men. We're looking for a pair of missing girls. Can't help you, Gideon said flatly. Wright didn't blink. They were last seen leaving the Ashworth property south of Denver, Christmas Eve night. Their names are Adelaide and Victoria Ashworth. Gideon kept his face still, but something shifted behind his eyes. Wright noticed. Their mother was Catherine Ashworth. You a lawman or a bounty hunter? Both, on occasion. This time I'm just following up on a report of 2 minors gone missing. Randall Ashworth hired us to track them. Randall Ashworth's the one you ought to be looking at, Gideon said, stepping slightly to block their view inside. Not some snow-covered mountain cabin. Wright's jaw tensed. And who might you be? Name's Gideon Hartley. That gave Wright pause. He looked the big man over again, eyes narrowing. You the same Hartley who served with the 10th in Shiloh? I was. He nodded slowly. Heard about you. Not all good, I imagine. No, but the part about not running from a fight. That stuck Wright's gaze drifted past Gideon's shoulder, toward the hearth. He noticed 2 tin cups on the table, still warm, steam curling up faintly. 2 bowls, 2 sets of spoons. That was enough to stir suspicion. You alone up here? Always, Wright shifted. Mind if we come in and look around? I do. One of the hired men stepped forward. We've got authority from the family to retrieve those girls. Their daddy's offering a sizable reward. You harboring them, you're committing a crime. Gideon didn't move. You threaten me in my own doorway, son. The man's hand went to his belt. Gideon's voice dropped, low and iron steady. Don't. There was no doubt in his tone, just finality. Wright lifted a hand. Easy. Let's not get stupid. The tension coiled thick in the cold air. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Gideon stepped back half a pace. You want to talk, Marshal? Fine, but only you. Leave the other 2 outside. Wright glanced at his men, nodded. They stepped back, reluctant but obedient. Inside, the cabin was dim but warm. The fire popped softly, the scent of stew still lingering from breakfast. Wright took off his gloves, his gaze roaming the space. Your cabin. Built it myself. He nodded once. Strong hands. Gideon poured 2 coffees and handed one over. I don't make a habit of lying to lawmen. So let's speak plain good. You work for Ashworth. I was hired by him. Doesn't mean I work for him. Gideon studied him. That's a line only honest men or liars say. Which are you? Depends on the day, Wright replied, sipping. But I can tell you this. Something about this case stinks. He waited 2 full days to report his daughters missing, claimed their mother ran off and took them, then changed the story when the locket turned up in the snow. Gideon froze. Locket? Silver one. Picture inside. Looks like Catherine when she was young. He showed it to you. No, sheriff in Denver found it in the girl's bedroom. Ashworth never mentioned it. Someone else turned it in. That's when I got suspicious. Gideon looked toward the hearth. He didn't speak. Wright leaned in. You know something, don't you? I know Catherine's dead. I know those girls ran for their lives. Wright sat straighter. You've seen them. Gideon didn't answer. Are they here, Hartley? Gideon's hand drifted again, slow and easy, to the rifle by the chair. His voice turned cold. You draw on me, I won't miss. I'm not drawing, Wright said quietly. I'm listening. That's all. Just tell me what happened. The silence hung thick again. Then Gideon exhaled and sat. They came Christmas Eve. Walked through a blizzard, dresses torn, hands near frozen. Told me Catherine was killed. Told me Ashworth hurt her. Wright leaned forward, voice lower now. You believe them? I do. He studied Gideon's face. And you believe Ashworth's behind it? I know he is. Wright stood and walked to the window. Outside, the other 2 men paced beside their horses, boots sinking in the snow. I don't trust Ashworth, he admitted, but I need proof. Stories don't hold up in court. Evidence does. They're children. And courts are cruel. Wright turned back. If you've got them, you need to protect them. But if Ashworth finds out they're here, he'll come back with papers and deputies. He'll bury this under money and lies. Gideon stood. Let him come. I'll be ready. Their eyes locked across the cabin. Then, from under the floorboards, a soft creak. Wright turned toward the noise. Gideon's hand shot to his rifle. Don't, he warned. Wright didn't move. Trap door? Gideon didn't answer. Wright raised both hands. I'm not here to take them. I just needed to know they're alive. You want to protect them? Then we need to work together. Gideon's fingers stayed on the rifle. Wright lowered his voice. I can help you, but I need time, and I need a reason. Gideon stepped forward. I'll give you one. Catherine was my daughter. Wright stared. You're their grandfather. I am. A long silence followed. Then Wright nodded once. That changes everything. Outside, a hawk circled above the ridge. Snow glittered along the branches. The other 2 men began walking toward the cabin again. Wright turned toward the door. I'll keep them outside. You've got my word. Gideon watched him go. The door closed behind the marshal. He walked to the trap door, knelt, and opened it slowly. Faith and Hope looked up, eyes wide. It's all right, he said. You can come out now. They climbed up one by one, pale but steady. Who were those men? Faith asked. People looking for answers. Hope tugged his sleeve. Are they gonna take us away? Gideon shook his head. Not if I've got anything to say about it. But even as he said the words, he felt it in his gut. This was only the beginning. Ashworth wasn't sending men to talk. He was sending them to erase. The kettle on the stove hissed, steam curling toward the low beams above. Gideon refilled 3 cups with strong coffee and poured warm milk into a smaller mug for each girl. Marshal Wright stood by the window, his arms folded, the light from the snow making the lines on his face seem deeper, older. Faith and Hope sat on the bearskin rug near the hearth, their backs straight, hands folded in their laps. They looked so small against the backdrop of stone and timber, but Gideon could see the weight they carried in their eyes. This wasn't just fear, it was memory, heavy and real. "You sure about this?" he asked them gently. Faith nodded. "Mama said truth matters more than anything." Hope clutched a small square of fabric in her fist silk, stained dark with dried blood. She hadn't let go of it since she'd crawled out of the trap door. "All right," Gideon said, his voice low and calm. "Then tell Marshal Wright what you told me." From the beginning, the marshal didn't move, but his attention sharpened like a blade drawn from its sheath. Faith spoke first. "It was snowing," she began. "Mama had packed a bag with food and water. She gave us coats. She told us we were leaving." "Why?" Wright asked softly. "She said it wasn't safe anymore. That he'd found out she wrote someone a letter. He was mad. He yelled a lot." Faith's hands tightened around the edge of her skirt. "She hid us in the closet. Told us not to come out until it was quiet," Hope continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we heard sounds, like things breaking. Mama cried. He hit her. Then the floor thumped real loud and it was quiet for a long time." Wright didn't speak. His face was unreadable. Faith's voice faltered for a moment. "When we came out, Mama was on the floor. Her nightdress was torn, and there was blood." Hope opened her fist and offered the blood-stained silk to Wright. "We took this so we wouldn't forget." Wright stepped forward slowly. He took the cloth from her with gloved fingers, examining it in silence. "Where exactly did this happen?" he asked. "In our house," Faith said, "south of Denver. The one with the glass windows that look out on the orchard." "That's Ashworth's main residence," Wright muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Gideon spoke then. "They followed the map Catherine drew. Through the storm. Found me 2 nights ago." Wright looked up sharply. "And you didn't come down to the law? You think the law would have listened? Ashworth has a judge in his pocket, and most of the town Wright didn't argue." The fire popped. No one moved. "I knew Catherine," Wright said finally. "Years ago. Saw her at a bank hearing, back when she was trying to get her name on the property deed. Ashworth blocked it. Said she wasn't stable enough. Said she spent money unwisely. But when I talked to her, she wasn't unstable. She was scared. Scared of him," Gideon said. Wright nodded. "I think so," Hope whispered. "Mama said if anything happened to her, we had to run. She said Grandpa would protect us." Wright turned to Gideon. "They knew who you were." He nodded. "She told them about me." "The cabin, the mountain shaped like a bear," Wright exhaled through his nose. "Ashworth never mentioned Catherine's death in the report. Claimed she took the girls and ran. That he was worried sick. Lying bastard," Gideon growled. Wright looked at the locket in Gideon's hand. "May I?" He handed it over. Wright opened the clasp, stared at the image inside. "Beautiful woman," he said quietly. "She was," Gideon replied. "Smart, too." Fierce Wright looked at the girls again. "And brave. These 2 walked through a snowstorm to save themselves. That's something Faith leaned against Hope. She taught us how to read stars, how to make snares. Said the world was dangerous, but that didn't mean we had to be." Wright returned the locket. "I believe them." Hope's eyes brightened. "Really?" "I believe every word." Gideon folded his arms. "What now?" "I have to go back," Wright said. "File a report. Start asking quiet questions. I can't accuse Ashworth without more. But I'll find something. And if he sends more men?" Wright's eyes met Gideon's. "Then you do what you do best." "You hold the line," Faith stood. "Are you going to tell him we're here?" "No," Wright said. "Not yet. You're safer if he doesn't know." Hope hugged him suddenly. The gesture caught him off guard. He patted her back gently, like a man not used to being touched by children. "I'll come back," he promised, "but be careful." Ashworth's not going to let this go. Gideon walked him to the door. Before stepping outside, Wright turned. "You ever think Catherine wrote that letter knowing it might never reach you?" "I've thought of little else. Maybe she just needed to believe there was still good in you." Even if she never saw it again, Gideon didn't reply. Wright stepped into the snow, mounted his horse, and rode off with the other two. Their silhouettes shrank into the trees. Back inside, Faith and Hope sat quietly, eyes heavy. "You girls need rest," Gideon said. "Long day." Hope looked up. "Do you think he'll come back?" "The bad man?" "Yes," Gideon said honestly. "But if he does, he'll find something waiting for him he didn't expect." "What's that?" Faith asked. "Me." He stayed by the fire until they were both asleep, their hands curled together beneath the quilt. Then he walked outside and looked up at the stars. A northern wind had picked up. Far off in the trees, a branch cracked. Not from snow. From something or someone moving. The ride down the mountain was quiet, save for the crunch of hooves on packed snow and the occasional sniffle from Hope, who clung to Gideon like a burr. Faith sat tall in the saddle, her arms looped loosely around Marshal Wright's waist, eyes scanning the woods as if every shadow might be the one to leap. Gideon rode behind them, rifle strapped to his back, his eyes sharp and restless. The wind bit through his coat, but he barely felt it. He'd barely felt anything since the trap door opened and the girls called him Grandpa. Wright had suggested taking the girls into town Cedar Falls, a place Gideon hadn't visited in over a decade. Said the law could do more there, could reach out to the circuit court, maybe even dig up something to finally stick to Ashworth. Gideon hadn't wanted to go, but Faith and Hope needed shelter, and he needed allies. Cedar Falls was a small town nestled between two ridges and a winding creek, the kind of place that kept its head down and its chin clean. Snow dusted the rooftops and wagons, lanterns glowed behind frosted windows, and smoke curled from every chimney. It looked peaceful, but Gideon knew better. Peace was often the prettiest lie. The town doctor, Elias Burnett, met them at the front steps of his clinic, a squat two-story building with chipping paint and windows full of books instead of curtains. A young woman stood just behind him, wool coat tight around her waist, auburn hair tucked into a knitted cap. Rebecca. She had her father's sharp eyes and a voice that could hush a saloon. Gideon hadn't seen her since she was 15, helping deliver calves on her family's ranch. Now she stood calm and sure, like she'd never left. "Marshal," she said, nodding to Wright. Then to Gideon. "You're taller than I remember. Most folks say the opposite." Faith and Hope huddled close to Gideon's legs as they dismounted. Rebecca's face softened. "You must be freezing. Let's get you warm inside." The clinic smelled of lavender and clean linens. Rebecca helped peel off coats and boots, her hands gentle, voice steady. She knelt to Faith's level. "I'm Rebecca. You can call me Becca if you like. I've got hot cocoa and a quilt made by my grandmother that's softer than anything you've ever touched." Faith hesitated, then nodded. Hope reached for her hand without a word. While the girls settled in, Wright pulled Gideon aside. "I'm sending a telegram to Judge Halbrook up in Denver. He's honest. Might take a few days to get a reply, but if anyone can look into Ashworth's estate, it's him." Gideon grunted. "And if Ashworth gets wind, he will. But he'll think they're still up on that mountain. That's what buys us time." Gideon stared out the window at the quiet street beyond. "I've seen what Ashworth does when he feels cornered." "We're not alone this time," Wright said, "and I know a few people in this town who still remember what Catherine tried to build here before he dragged her off." Rebecca returned, brushing snow from her sleeves. They're asleep, she said, Hope still clinging to that bloody scrap. I didn't ask. They trust you, Gideon. He didn't answer. She tilted her head. You look like a man trying not to breathe too deep. I don't deserve their trust, he said. Rebecca's voice was quiet. Maybe not. But you've got it. He looked at her then, really looked. Her face had the same freckles, the same eyes as before. But there was something new, a steadiness. She'd grown into her bones. How long you been running this place? He asked. 4 years. Papa's eyesight started going. I stayed. Didn't expect that. Neither did I. She smiled. He didn't. They call you Papa, she said softly. He nodded. First time was yesterday. Nearly broke me. You thinking of keeping them? His jaw tightened. They're not strays. I didn't mean it like that. I know. A long silence stretched between them. Rebecca broke it. I remember Catherine. She once gave me a hand-sewn apron for my birthday. Said even if a girl didn't cook, she should know how to keep a pocket knife on her. Gideon almost smiled. Almost. She had your fire, Rebecca said. But her heart, that was her mother's. Wide open and too soft for this world, he looked away. The next morning, Wright wired Denver. Gideon stayed at the clinic, splitting wood for the stove and fixing the front steps, just to keep his hands moving. Faith followed him everywhere. Hope stayed close to Rebecca, drawing pictures with ink and feather pens. That night, after the girls were asleep, Rebecca poured 2 mugs of mulled cider and joined Gideon on the porch. You ever think about leaving these mountains? She asked. Not since I came back from the war. You could. You're still strong, still mean enough to scare most folks straight. He sipped the cider. Maybe. But not yet. No, he said. Not yet. Rebecca's eyes lingered on him for a moment. You're not as hard as you pretend. I don't pretend. You do. But only when you think someone's watching. He turned to look at her. Their breath made twin clouds in the cold. Inside, the girls stirred in their sleep. Rebecca rose. You'll stay here tonight. Safer. I don't need safe. They do. She touched his hand briefly before heading back in. The door closed softly behind her. He stood alone under the stars, the wind whispering through the pines. From the shadows of the alley across the street, a man watched the clinic window flicker with lamplight. His coat was black. His breath reeked of old flowers. He turned and disappeared into the dark. The wind carried a strange stillness as the telegraph wires trembled above the train station office in Cedar Falls. Marshal Wright stood at the counter, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the telegram he'd just received from Denver. He read it once, then again, and once more, slower. The words were clear, inevitable, and wrong. An arrest warrant, issued by a federal judge on behalf of the Ashworth estate. Charge, unlawful detainment and kidnapping of minors. Name, Gideon Hartley. Wright didn't curse, he didn't move. He simply folded the telegram into quarters and slid it into his coat pocket. Behind his eyes, the storm had already started. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Back at the clinic, Gideon was chopping wood behind the shed, shirt sleeves rolled up, breath steaming with every swing. He looked calmer than Wright felt, stronger too. But the lines around his eyes were deeper this morning. Rebecca met Wright on the porch. You got news, she said. He nodded. Is it bad? He hesitated. Depends how you define it. Rebecca stepped back to let him in. Inside, the girls were playing with scraps of cloth and buttons near the fire, making dolls out of leftover bandages. Faith glanced up and smiled when she saw the marshal. Hope offered him one of the tiny figures. This one has a badge, she said proudly. Wright took it carefully. She looks brave. She is? Rebecca poured coffee while Wright knelt beside the girls. You two doing all right? Faith nodded. Papa says we're safe now. Wright's gaze flicked toward the hallway, where Gideon's heavy steps echoed on the wood. Yeah, he said softly. I hope so. Moments later, Gideon stepped inside, wiping sweat from his brow with a kerchief. You get your reply? He asked. Wright nodded. Gideon took one look at his face and knew. What's it say? The court believes the girls were taken without legal consent. Ashworth filed a formal complaint. Claims you manipulated Catherine into hiding them, then fled with them after her disappearance. Gideon's shoulders rose with a slow breath. Disappearance. Wright handed him a second envelope. But that came too. Gideon opened it. Inside were typewritten pages, rough and misaligned. It was a copy of a sworn affidavit filed 6 weeks before Catherine's death. A letter from Catherine herself. She'd requested full custody of her daughters, citing emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and threats against her life. She included hand-drawn plans of the estate and copies of transactions made without her signature. There, at the bottom, was a final line in her handwriting. If anything happens to me, protect the girls. Find Gideon. He will know what's right. Gideon stared at the paper for a long time. His lips barely moved when he spoke. She knew he'd kill her. Wright nodded slowly. But it was never entered into the official court record. Someone buried it, Rebecca leaned in. And now they're trying to bury Gideon. Gideon looked at the girls, now watching from across the room, their faces tight with worry. I'm not letting them go back, he said. No one's asking you to, Wright replied. Gideon stood. Then what are you saying? Wright looked tired, older than his years. I'm saying the law is coming. The moment this hits Ashworth's desk, he'll send deputies, lawyers, whoever he has in his pocket. And they'll have papers with real stamps and real signatures. Rebecca said, So we run? I didn't say that, Wright said. But you didn't say stay either, Gideon cut in. I'm saying we make it public, Wright replied. We take this to a judge we trust. Not just in letters or whispers, in court. With people watching. That'll take time, Rebecca said. And time is what we don't have. Faith came over, slipping her hand into Gideon's. Are we in trouble? He looked down at her, his face softening. No, sweetheart. Not you, Hope joined them. Are they going to take us away again? No, he said. Not while I'm breathing. Wright turned away, pacing. They'll say I obstructed justice, he muttered. They'll strip my badge. Rebecca stepped forward. Then let them. Because justice doesn't live on paper. It lives in people who stand when no one else does. Gideon looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes, a spark of something he hadn't let himself feel in years. We've got to move, Wright said. I'll send a message to Halbrook. Arrange a formal hearing. But until then, the girls need to be somewhere they can't be grabbed. Back to the cabin, Gideon asked. No, they'll check there first. You have another place? Gideon nodded. An old hunting shack. Northwest Ridge. My father built it in '68, not even marked on most maps. Good, Wright said. Pack tonight. Leave before sunrise. I'll stay behind and slow anyone who comes asking. Rebecca didn't flinch. I'm going with them. Wright raised an eyebrow. You sure? I'm not letting 2 frightened girls and a man half made of guilt wander into the wilderness alone. I can help, Gideon looked at her. It won't be easy. Wasn't planning on easy. The 3 of them stood in silence, a quiet bond forming in the middle of uncertainty. Faith tugged his coat. Are we going home again? He knelt beside her. Not yet. But someday? He looked toward Rebecca, then to the window, where snow began to fall again, soft and slow. Someday, he said, we'll make one. That night, as the town quieted and the lamplight dimmed, a stranger stepped into the telegraph office. His coat was black, boots caked with dried mud. He asked for the last outgoing telegram and slipped the clerk a silver coin. Then he read it. Then he smiled, and he walked out without closing the door. The wind howled across the rooftops of Cedar Falls like a mourning mother, tearing at the shutters and whistling through the cracks in the clinic walls. Snow drifted thick and fast, turning the world into a blur of white and shadow. It was the kind of night sane folks stayed inside and let the storm pass. But Gideon Hartley wasn't one of those folks. He had the saddle cinched tight before the town clock struck 2. Faith and hope were bundled in extra layers, small hands tucked into his coat as they rode double behind him on the gelding. Rebecca followed close behind on a second horse, rifle slung across her back and a satchel pressed to her chest like it carried something more fragile than bones. They took the back alley out of town, slipping past the blacksmith's barn and the closed post office, where the lamplight still flickered. Wright had left the stable door unlatched and the gate open, a silent signal, a final favor. No one spoke as they crossed the riverbank, only the wind had a voice. Faith whispered, "Will they follow us?" "Yes," Gideon said, "but not fast enough." The trail narrowed as they climbed. Pines pressed in on either side, their branches heavy with snow. Rebecca's horse stumbled once, nearly throwing her, but she steadied it with a quiet word and kept riding. They reached the first switchback by sunrise. Pink light broke over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows on the snow. It was then, as Gideon paused to let the horses breathe, that Faith tugged at his coat. "Papa," she said softly, "we have something." Hope reached into her cloak and pulled out a small tin box, dented and cold from the ride. Inside, wrapped in wool, was a folded envelope and a pair of yellowing documents. "We found them in Mama's sewing drawer," Faith said. "We didn't tell you before because we didn't understand what they were." Gideon took the envelope. It was addressed in Catherine's hand. His name was written with deliberate care. Inside, the letter was short. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry. I should have come sooner. But I didn't want to bring trouble to your door. I always knew you'd protect them if it came to this. There's more. Look inside the ring. Forgive me if you can. Love always, Catherine." His breath caught. The ring. He reached into the satchel where he'd kept her locket and wedding band. The gold was tarnished, worn thin around the edges. But inside, just beneath the curve, was a tiny crease, a hidden seam. He pressed, and a paper unfurled. Rebecca leaned over to look. It was a list. Names, dates, bank amounts. She gasped. "These are Ashworth's transactions. Illegal withdrawals, land purchases under false names. Donations to judges." Faith held up the birth certificates. Hope added, "Mama signed them. Said you were our guardian." Gideon stared at the papers, then at the faces watching him. This wasn't just about the girls anymore. This was evidence. Real, damning, dangerous. Rebecca whispered, "She gave you everything to take him down." He nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. "She planned this, even if it cost her." Faith pressed closer. "You'll stop him, won't you?" He looked out at the mountains ahead. They had miles yet to ride, and when they came down the other side, there would be men waiting. Men with badges bought and paid for, men who didn't care about truth-only power. "I will," he said. They rode harder after that. At dusk, they reached the old hunting shack. It sat beneath a cliff face shaped like a sleeping bear, just as Catherine had described to the girls. Inside, the hearth was still intact, and Gideon had it burning within minutes. Hope curled beside Rebecca on a cot. Faith sat with Gideon, her head resting against his side, watching the flames. "You think Mama knew we'd be safe here?" "I think she knew you'd lead me home." She smiled, eyes fluttering shut. Gideon looked at Rebecca, who was unrolling her bedroll by the door. Their eyes met. Nothing needed to be said. Outside, night deepened. Stars blinked through the clouds, and at the bottom of the ridge, 3 riders stopped at a broken branch in the snow, their eyes scanning the trail ahead. One of them wore a black coat, his breath sweet with the scent of dead flowers. He dismounted, knelt, and touched the hoofprint. "They're close," he said. Then he stood and grinned. The horses were coated in sweat and frost by the time Gideon led the small group back into the quiet heart of Cedar Falls. The streets were empty, too empty. Snow covered every rooftop like the town was holding its breath. Rebecca rode beside him, her eyes scanning the corners. Faith and hope clung to the saddle in front of Gideon, silent but wide-eyed. Somewhere behind them, Marshal Wright and Dr. Patterson had already returned, spreading word in whispers to the few townsfolk they could trust. Inside the clinic, a fire crackled. Wright unfolded a map on the doctor's desk, pointing. "Ashworth's coming in from the west. 6 riders, minimum. They've got a federal warrant signed by Judge Halcombe." Rebecca folded her arms. "Halcombe's been in Ashworth's pocket for years. We can't stop them with words," Wright said. "But if we present what we have, Catherine's affidavit, the ring, the girls' birth certificates, there's a chance we can stall them." "Maybe long enough." "Long enough for what?" Gideon asked. Patterson looked up from the stove. "For the governor to get here." Rebecca frowned. "You sent for him?" Wright nodded. "I wired Halbrook and the state office 2 days ago. I didn't say names, just facts, evidence. They sent word back this morning. And?" Gideon asked. "Governor Renner's riding in himself. With 2 federal marshals," Rebecca blinked. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Or both," Wright said. They didn't have to wait long. By nightfall, hooves echoed through town. Ashworth arrived in a black duster, flanked by hired guns and a man in a city suit carrying a leather folio. He dismounted like he owned the earth beneath his boots. Inside the clinic, Gideon stood tall near the fireplace, faith and hope tucked safely in Rebecca's care. Wright opened the door with calm precision. Ashworth stepped in, all arrogance and spit-polished boots. "I've come for my property," he said. "They're not yours," Gideon replied, voice low and flat. Ashworth smirked. "The court says otherwise." "So did Catherine," Rebecca said sharply, holding up the envelope. Ashworth waved a hand. "Dead women can't testify." "But living children can," Wright added. Ashworth's smirk faltered. "This town's forgotten who holds the purse strings." At that moment, the door creaked again, and Governor Renner walked in. The room stilled. He was shorter than expected, older, wore no badge, just a stern expression and travel-worn boots. Behind him, 2 federal marshals flanked the door. Renner spoke without raising his voice. "I've read every document. The warrant you carry is invalid. Judge Halcombe has been suspended pending investigation." Ashworth turned, his face blanching. "This is illegal." "No," Renner said. "This is justice." One of Ashworth's men twitched toward his holster. Gideon moved faster. In a blink, his rifle was up. So was Wright's. And the federal marshals. Guns were drawn in every direction. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Then Ashworth lunged for Faith. The shot rang out. Ashworth fell before he reached her, his coat blooming red at the shoulder. One of the marshals lowered his weapon. In the stunned silence that followed, Hope burst into tears. Gideon dropped his rifle and swept both girls into his arms. Renner turned to Wright. "Bring the rest in. This town deserves clean hands and clean law." Wright nodded. Ashworth groaned from the floor, clutching his arm. "This isn't over," he hissed. "No," Gideon said, "but your part is." As dawn crept in through the clinic window, Renner signed an order placing the girls under Gideon's custody, pending final court review. Faith watched the signature like it was the first thing she truly believed in. Outside, snow began to melt from the rooftops. For the first time in years, the thaw had begun. In the silence that followed, Rebecca took Gideon's hand and didn't let go. 3 months passed like the soft drift of mountain fog, slow, quiet, full of breath and grace. Spring crept gently over the highlands, curling around the cabin Gideon built with his own hands. It wasn't grand 2 rooms, a stone hearth, a garden fenced with hand-cut rails, but it was enough. More than enough. It was home. Faith and hope now bore the name Hartley. The ink had dried on the papers 2 weeks earlier, delivered by Marshall Wright himself, along with a tin of peppermint candy and a wink for each girl. The girls had never known what it meant to belong until now. Their laughter filled the hills, louder than the wind. Rebecca taught them letters each morning beside the window, while Gideon repaired the roof or fetched water from the creek. Some days they'd hike up the ridge together, where wildflowers bloomed and deer stood unafraid. Some nights they'd read psalms aloud by firelight, Faith always trying to beat Gideon to the Amen. A new photo hung above the mantel, taken by the traveling photographer who passed through town the previous week. Gideon in his vest and brown cowboy hat, Rebecca in her pale blue dress, the twins between them holding matching quilts. No one smiled big, but no one had to. The peace in their eyes said everything. A letter came from Cedar Falls. Marshall Wright's scrawl was blunt and proud. Ashworth and his men were convicted. Catherine's assets had been restored. The girls' names had been cleared in public record. Judge Halcombe had resigned under federal review. Justice, slow but certain, had arrived. Rebecca folded the letter and slid it into the Bible. That night, snow began to fall again, light and late, the kind that didn't bite but blessed. Faith and hope pressed their noses to the frosted glass, watching the flakes drift down like stars. Gideon stoked the fire until the cabin glowed gold and warm. Then he sat in his old chair and called them close. "All right now," he said, voice soft as worn leather. "One chapter before sleep." They curled up on either side of him, heads resting on his arms. He opened the Bible to a marked page, then paused. "What does it say tonight, Papa?" Faith asked. He smiled. "It says that the Lord is close to the broken-hearted, and he saves those crushed in spirit." Hope whispered, "Like Mama?" He nodded. "And like anyone who chooses to love when it's hard." Rebecca watched from the doorway, arms crossed gently, heart full. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire never dimmed. In a world that had nearly forgotten him, Gideon Hartley had found something no lawman, no outlaw, no wind-whipped winter could ever take again. A family built not of blood, but of promise. A home not made of wood, but of kindness. And a love that came not in thunder, but in snowflakes. As he closed the Bible and kissed the girls goodnight, a quiet voice rose in him, one he hadn't heard in years. It said, "Begin again." And so he did. Because in the wild lands of the West, not every cowboy is running from something. Some are riding toward redemption. And sometimes, just sometimes, Christmas brings more than snow. It brings legacy. If this story moved your heart, there's more coming. Subscribe to Western Legacy for the next chapter in the Hartley family journey and discover the true meaning of courage, love, and second chances in the untamed American frontier.